Can this mysterious giant wolf truly integrate into the new pack? What kind of story will unfold between her and the one who claims to be her mate? Can she who was created get rid of the shadow of the past and start a brand new life? Dive into the world of genetically modified werewolves. Subscribe. Chapter 6. If you do want to be responsible for each and every member of your PPAC's death, then I suggest you prepare that room. Dexter stuttered, but his tone was serious. He would love to let 9 free, but the possibility of her losing control and slaughtering everyone in sight was too high. Especially when this was their chance to finally join a pack that could possibly protect her from Victor. Nobody moved as a thick atmosphere fell upon the room. Dexter felt he just ruined their chances, and was about to speak when suddenly Slade growled loudly. Everyone watched as he abruptly stormed out the room, but only one had deadly intentions after noticing the alpha having a weak moment. A vulnerable target perfect for a predator to prey on. 9's eyes gleamed dangerously as she stared at the door the male left through. Sighing, Paul rubbed his forehead before taking over. "Ryan, go make the preparations," he said almost tiredly. Hesitantly the beater moved to leave the room, but Dexter's voice made him pause. "If possible, could you get a large and enough truck to fit N9 in? She won't shift to Hummin." Ryan's brows dipped and looked to Paul for confirmation. He wasn't exactly comfortable treating his future Luna so lowly, but when Paul nodded, he didn't have a choice and walked away. "Is that all?" Paul asked, hoping that it was, but when the man looked down timidly he knew it wasn't. Could you clear the path for 9? She's trying to kill any wolf that she sees," Dexter explained grimly. Paul shook his head in disbelief. What was Victor thinking? Using her like a weapon? All he had to do was look at Nolan, who nodded his head and moved to the exit. "Very well. Nolan will clear a path and then you will walk her to the truck," he said and then turned away. Paul had to do what Dexter thought was best. Hopefully the she-wolf would learn to trust others, but for now, he had to go find his son. It must be hard on him knowing that his mate does not trust him, or show any signs of feeling the pull. Paul sent a silent prayer to the moon goddess, hoping that this will all end well. Back in the room, 9 turned her attention to Dexter, who was opening the lock on the door. She found it strange because she was so used to walking through the trap door that led to the arena. Never once had she been let out from her cage except that few times her master took her to his lab, as Dexter called it. 9 couldn't pronounce the long one. "They said we are joining a pack." 9 spoke and watched her friend pull the door wider. "Do I have to fight there too?" she asked curiously. Dexter paused and smiled grimly. "No. Remember how I told you about PP packs PR protecting each other?" He moved inside the cage and reached to unlock the shackles on her neck and legs. "We will finally have a home. No more fighting." Just as the last silver chain dropped to the ground, and 9 took her first step outside the cage she spent her whole life in, Dexter whispered, "You're free, 9." 9 stared at her friend. Her eyes then glided to the floor, as she took her first steps, until she was completely out of that concrete box. She felt an indescribable feeling in the pit of her stomach, as she looked back at the cage. Even her body felt different now that the restraints were off. It's been over 15 years since she was first chained. Her mind was still puzzled as she tried to piece things together. 9 didn't know how to feel, but placed her trust in Dexter. "Come." He placed a hand on her shoulder and moved towards the exit. Her senses picked up everything. Her heart began to pump faster, making 9 more agitated. She was not used to this, she felt almost scared. Dexter kept whispering comforting words as they moved to a hallway lined with smaller cages on either side. Some of them were open and she could smell the lingering scent of other werewolves. 9 began to stir, Her hunting instincts were kicking in and the beast was not making it any easier. All she wanted to do was to hunt and kill her prey. That was her life, that's what her master created her for. Feeling her anxiety, Dexter gently ran his hand through her fur. Together they moved to another door that led to the arena, but instead of in the cage, they were outskirts of it, near the stands. They were walking on the bottom level while everyone else was on the top. Pack members and the few alphas ceased in all activity and stared openly at 9. She flattened her ears and began to snarl threateningly at all the males. The warriors were quick to turn away from the aggressive she-wolf. They've seen her in action and don't wish to go up against her. Dexter was quick to lead 9 to the exit. Double doors were the last obstacle, and he moved to open them. Just as he did, the sun cast a glow through the threshold. 9 immediately backed up and blinked repeatedly at the light. All at once different scents and smells bombarded her senses. Backing away even further, she shook her large head before bowing low in fear. Whining, 9 almost turned back when Dexter grabbed her by her fur. "It's okay. I am here with you," he said in a soothing voice. This is your chance to finally smell all the pretty flowers and see the things I told you about. 9 paused and stared at Dexter. Her heart raced and muscles bunched, ready to run. "It's okay, he nodded. Taking a deep, shaky breath, 9 took a tentative step towards the threshold. With encouraging words, she kept moving forward, only hesitating for a few seconds. Then it was time for 9 to take her first steps into the sunlight. The warmth of the sun was strange to her as she continued moving forward. Then suddenly she felt something brush through her fur, but could not see anything. Jumping back in shock, she almost pushed Dexter over in her retreat. "It's just the wind." Dexter reassured her, but 9 looked to him pleadingly, almost wanting to go back to the cage. She'd never been this afraid before, the sudden change was frightening her. But Dexter shook his head and gave her a stern look. "I'm right here, nothing will happen to you." 9's tail moved slightly in between her legs and her shoulders hunched. She trusted Dexter and slowly lifted her head to sniff the air. So many aromas she inhaled, but none of them seemed threatening. Forcing herself to move, 9 finally reached the end of the concrete pathway. Blinking again, her eyes took a while to adjust to the glare of the sun, but once they did, 9 couldn't help but look around wildly. Her ears perked up in excitement and eyes widened in awe. "Dex? It's the woods just like you showed me," she exclaimed in enthusiasm, her tongue rolling out her mouth. Cautiously she moved and touched gently on the rocky ground. She never felt anything but concrete, so it felt very bizarre to feel something so rough and bumpy under her paws. 9 giddily trotted around, getting a feel for the ground before spotting a patch of green grass. Like a child experiencing everything for the first time, she playfully skipped up to it and laid down completely on the ground, just gazing at the grass in curious wonder before lifting her right paw and lightly tapped the grass and then quickly removing her paw away, as if the grass would sting her. Dexter grinned and looked proudly at 9. He almost choked with emotion at her childlike innocence. He watched her stand up and step on the grass. She whipped around to him and yipped in happiness, and then began to sniff around the woods. Finally his friend could live her life the way she deserves to. Little did the friends know that they had a small audience who watched them from behind. All 4 of them beginning to understand the extent of 9's neglect, and all had a newfound hate for Victor Bain and his rogue followers. "I know she may not be the mate you wanted," Paul spoke to his son, who watched 9 with a soft and tender expression, "but be the mate she needs." Slade took a deep breath. "I know, father," he said strongly. He was determined to give his mate everything, take her places she's never been, and just give her the life she deserves. She will be pampered to the fullest, and no more will she be Victor's puppet. He'd rather die than let that happen again. "Come on. Dexter is calling us over." Paul said, breaking Slade's thoughts. Slade took the lead, eager to be closer to his mate. Ryan and Nolan walked behind with his father, but as they got closer, Dexter quickly shook his head and told them to stop. He looked nervously at Slade and fidgeted with his hands. He didn't know how to tell the alpha, but he had no choice. I am SSS sorry I'll alpha Slade BB but N9 is no not comfortable W with you. S she sees you as a threat B because she does not UN understand the M mating pool. Dexter explained and felt extremely horrible because he was an alpha and their feelings for their mates were 10 times stronger than a normal werewolf. Slade clenched his fists and tried to mask his hurt. He felt his wolf whined in sadness, but there was nothing he could do. He should have guessed that she didn't know about mates. I understand, he said in a strong voice, but inside it was killing him. He looked behind Dexter to his mate, who was watching him silently, but her body was tense and alert. I will meet you at the pack house, he said with a rigid nod and turned to walk away with his head low. His friends and father held in their sympathy and turned towards Nine's guardian. I was hoping to introduce Nine to T, the one who is DI driving us to the par CK. So she doesn't kill him, Dexter said bluntly and scratched the back of his head. Ryan and Nolan, Paul said instantly, turning to the wide-eyed males with a challenging look. The guys were hesitant and he couldn't blame them, but this was their future Luna, might as well get used to her now. Go on. I'll be going with Slade. He nodded his head in Dexter's direction and then left them. The guys gulped nervously and moved slowly to the small man, hoping he could protect them from his scary friend. Ryan pushed Nolan so he would go first, but the Omega pushed back, and soon a shoving match commenced, each trying to hide behind the other. Nine watched them amusement, but still her body was ready for a fight. The unlucky person was weaker one, Nolan if she remembers correctly. The beta Ryan used his status as an advantage so the other had no choice. Asshole, Nolan grumbled and then stopped just in front of Dexter. She watched and listened as Dexter explained the rules. Nine didn't get how he could easily trust those wolves. They were no different than the other ones she faced off, those that didn't smell like a rogue. It was only when Dexter told her that they were pack members did she understand why they smelt weird, like a mix of different scents. Either way, she was trained to kill all werewolves and they were no exception. But she would always remember the look in their eyes before they died. The hurt, sadness, pain. Some of them let out a low, strangled howl, calling to someone though she never knew who. Sometimes Nine could swear she would hear a howl back, filled with the same misery as the one who died. She would always feel something, but she didn't know what, and at the end of the fight, Nine would drift into an almost melancholy daze, just thinking about it. Shaking her head to get rid of her thoughts, her ears picked up Dexter's last words. At all cost, do not teach UCH her or lower K her in the ES. Cherie will SP speak to you if she wants, he said, and the guys nodded. Dexter turned her way. He shot her a warning look and Nine almost wanted to go against him, but because her friend trusted them, she would try and behave. N9, Thigh, this is Bibita Ryan and OM Mega, no Nolan, Dexter introduced when they were a few feet from her. Hey, Ryan mumbled, looking down, and Nolan waved a hand while shuffling anxiously. She could hear their hearts beat loudly in their chest. Her predatory instincts were kicking in, but she forced herself to not strike out. They won't attack you, just trust Dexter. Do it for him, Nine. With those thoughts, she took a step towards them. Years of training to kill were kicking in. She felt her teeth lengthen and the need to tear them to pieces as she stood a foot away. She took deep, even breaths to calm herself and the beast. Lowering her head, because she was taller, Nine took a whiff of Ryan because he was the strongest here. If she labels him a threat, then she would quickly eliminate him. Ryan made sure his head was down and tried to remain calm, as his Luna circled him like a prey, glancing at him with those eyes. God, those cat eyes were scary looking, he thought when her muzzle was an inch away from his head. He forced himself not to look at those jagged teeth. He could only image how it feels to be bit by those teeth and prayed it didn't come true. 9 stood to her full height and stared down at the nervous male. She took a peek at Dexter, who was fidgeting nervously, as his eyes kept switching from her to the males. Ryan let out his breath he was holding when she moved on to Nolan. He'd never felt so relieved in his life. He sagged his shoulders feeling like he was on the brink of death, as he felt like he only had half his soul left, after the other half left his body. Man, I need a drink after this, Ryan thought exhaustedly. 9 moved on to the last one. She quickly concluded he was too weak to be of any danger to her or Dexter. The smell rolling off him was actually rather calming to her. Her muscles soon relaxed and she shook her dark fur before trotting behind Dexter, who looked like he lost a few years of his life at how nervous and stressed he was. I'm not that bad, Dex. If you trust them, then I will not kill them straight away. 9 told her friend to calm his nerves. Dexter gave her a thankful smile and then turned to the men who were silently watching them. Should we go? He asked. Ryan nodded and started to walk to the right where the big white van was parked, that 9 failed to notice. Her head tilted to the side as she took in the big metal thing. A car? She asked in wonder, not realizing she spoke to all of them through the link. Ryan and Nolan paused to look at her and then to each other. Ryan shook his head in silent anger and moved to the driver's seat. He was particularly pissed off because his younger sister was taken by rogues and murdered. She was so innocent, just like 9, she was too young to die and didn't get the chance to explore the world like she wanted to. Nolan moved slightly next to his Luna. It's called a van. Sorry we couldn't get a bigger one, he told her. 9 looked down at him and then back at the vehicle. Moving towards it, she took a sniff of it, identifying another new smell. There were so many things she knew, but have not seen or touched in real life. It was actually going to be her first ride in a CA van. 9 was nervous and excited at the same time. Her eyes brightened and hopped effortlessly in the back when Dexter opened the door. The car jolted roughly, making Ryan jump in his seat. Shit! He grumbled when his head hit the roof of the vehicle. Rubbing it, he looked through the rearview mirror at 9. The back of the van sunk low as she laid down. It was a tight squeeze when Dexter joined her because there were only 2 seats in front. Watch our tail, Nolan said to his Luna. She couldn't move to glare at him, so she opted for a low growl. Shutting the door, Nolan quickly got to the passenger's seat, and Ryan started the van. Ready? Ryan asked through the rearview mirror. Dexter nodded whilst 9 was too busy staring out the windows as Ryan began to drive. Throughout the 3-hour journey, 9 looked everywhere like a kid in a candy store. Ryan and Nolan pointed things out to her that got her so excited that she forgot that she didn't trust them and listened intently to what they said. She also kept asking questions, to which all 3 guys answered her. They had permanent grins on their faces at the innocent questions she asked. The guys found it extremely hard to hate 9 after they witnessed this side of her. Now they understood why Dexter was willing to put his life on the line for her. The beater turned into an exit that led to a rocky road surrounded by trees. We are almost there, he said just as they passed the pack house. He knew they had to keep going towards the jailhouse for the rogue wolves they kept caged. It was further away from the pack house for obvious safety reasons. He didn't want to take his Luna there, but it was his alpha's orders. With a heavy heart, Ryan drove towards the concrete building which would be guarded by their top warriors, but since they didn't have any captured rogues, the jailhouse was empty. Well, not anymore, he thought bitterly. 9 leaned to the left and stared in amazement at the pack house as they passed it. She wondered if she could go inside, but knew that wouldn't happen, because that's not where she was supposed to stay. Her place was behind silver bars. she didn't think it would change just because she moved to a pack. As she moved closer to the window to get the last view of the building, the whole van suddenly shifted to the side and Ryan had to jerk the wheel to steady the vehicle. It was dangerous when 9 moved because with her weight, the car could easily topple over. 9. Ryan shouted and unconsciously his beta power dripped into his voice. Their guy's eyes widened at Ryan's mistake. Dexter quickly tried to distract 9, while Nolan shot a glare at a nervous beta. Immediately 9 sensed the challenge, and snapped her head to him, eyes narrowed in a lethal glare. The beast hated to be ordered and roared at the worthless wolf. It emitted its dominance that made the males bow their head in submission. Luck was on their side when Ryan pulled to a stop just outside the jailhouse. Dexter rushed to open the door and got out. He knew he couldn't ask 9 to leave in this state. She had to make sure that the guys knew who was above them, or else she would show them, and it would not be a pretty sight. "NN9. Dexter said, whispered so softly. Lifting her head up as far as she could, she made sure that Ryan and Nolan didn't move an inch. It was always the dominant one who controls how they act, leaving them no choice but to follow. It was basic wolf instincts, making sure that everyone had a rank and whenever they stepped out of line they must be put back into their place. All alphas would use their voice, but 9 had a more primal beast within her that would use brute force as punishment. She snarled one last time before stepping out of the van. She was in no mood to explore. The beast was pacing in agitation, and could easily snap at anyone who crossed her. One look at Dexter and he quickly led her into the building. A familiar scent drifted in her nose. 9 bristled at the alpha who makes her feel vulnerable. He was watching her in concern a couple of feet away. If it wasn't for Dexter standing in between them, then she would have already charged at the alpha. Choosing to ignore him, Dexter was able to lead her into a cell. It wasn't like her old one. It had a small window on the opposite wall, and was largely built, but 9 could easily break out since the silver bars were so thin compared to the other ones. She shook her body to relieve some tension. All 9 wanted was to be left alone. She moved to the center and laid down, her back to the entrance, and she stared blankly at the wall in front of her. "I'll be back 9. "Oh, okay," Dexter said, but fell on deaf ears. Closing the door of the cell, he sighed and walked outside the building. His eyes fell upon the alpha, who watched him emotionlessly. "I need answers," he said bluntly, and Dexter nodded. Knowing this would have come sooner or later. He hoped Alpha Slade had an open mind because what he was about to tell him might just get 9 and him killed. Chapter 7. The guys all moved to the pack house. Then they walked to Slade's office where his father was waiting patiently for them. Walking behind the desk, Slade sat down and leaned forward, placing his linked hands on the desk. "Speak," he said gruffly. He was in no mood for beating around the bush. His mate hated him, or wants anything to do with him. He was going to learn everything he could about his beautiful mate, and try to understand her so he could finally begin to gain her trust. But by the looks of it, it was going to be hard. "Ah, right." Dexter nodded his head and then took a seat. He was intimidated by all the wolves spread out in the room and blocked his exits. He knew just because he was going to be part of the pack, that he had to earn their trust. It wasn't given lightly. Gulping, he wiped away a stray bead of sweat from his temple before speaking. "Where do you want me to start?" he asked and tried not to fiddle one of his bad habits. Slade paused for a second. "You said she was created." He trailed off for the man to continue. Dexter nodded his head and then began to explain what 9 was. He recalled the memory over 20 years ago, to the very first day he discovered Victor's dark obsession. 7-year-old Dexter pulled open the heavy door. He turned back to make sure no one saw him. Uncle Victor was out running an errand, so it was the perfect time to sneak into the room. With one last look, Dexter nervously stepped inside the dark hallway. Uncle Victor told him not to enter that room, but his curious mind wanted to know what's behind it. His little feet took him deeper, until he saw a dim light in the end. His ears strained to hear any sound, making sure no one was inside the room. Peeking around the corner, his eyes widened in awe. Stepping out from the wall, Dexter slowly walked and took in everything. A reclining chair was to his left, like the ones he saw in a dentist, but they had bloody chains hanging on the armrest. There was a smaller metal table next to it with sharp tools. Dexter noticed the dried blood on it and chose to stay away from it. To his right was a long desk that extended to the end of the room. Piles of paper were scattered over it and other equipment that you would only see in high-tech laboratories. Further across from him was 2 large bookshelves and another door next to it. He made a mental note to go through that door, but first he wanted to explore this room. Walking carefully, he moved to the desk and climbed on the chair. He picked up a random paper and looked through it. Dexter was very smart for his age, a prodigy as Uncle Victor told him. He mostly loved science and would read tons of books his uncle would give him so he could understand most of what the paper was saying. Dexter then spotted an open book that looked well used as papers and notes stuck out of it. With his little hands, he picked it up and began to flip through it. He noted that this book was like a diary of some sort. He didn't think Uncle Victor was the type of person to keep one. It was filled with notes and pictures of werewolves. Dexter found a page that seemed interesting and began to read. The Lycan Werewolf Ancestors. If done correctly and using the purest bloodline of lycanthropy, my creation should possess the feral and vicious nature of a lycan. Fascinating creatures they are. They are the pure werewolves, as I like to call them. Though those fools from the council disagreed and called them a rogue abomination. Yet they forgets that it is because of the lycans that we the werewolves exist. They are our ancestors, but do not possess a human side. Just a savage predator, born to kill. Dexter trailed down to see a picture of a lycan. He almost gasped at how frightening the monster looked. He began to read the description below. The lycans evolved to be able to stand on 2 legs and stand about 7 feet tall. Muscle upon muscle covered every inch of the beast to give it its strength and power. 4-inch claws at the tip of its fingers, always sharpened and ready to deliver the final blow. Strong jaw muscles held in jagged-like teeth made for shredding and tearing. But what really captured my attention was the savage look in their crimson eyes. The beast was always bloodthirsty, he hungered to kill everything in his path. I knew I must get a hold of one of these creatures. I must have it for my experiment. Flipping a couple pages ahead, Dexter found the part he was looking for and continued reading. It's hard to come across lycans nowadays because as soon as werewolves outnumbered them, they easily saw them as a threat and worked their way to killing them. Only a handful exist to this day, though they only live far deep into the woods and mountains, any place where people are few cautious to come out of hiding, but will kill everything on sight. I have deep respects those magnificent creatures, and can only wish I were one. I remembered the lycan we caught, however it was no easy feat. I lost 20 of my strongest men, just trying to keep the beast from running back into the thick forest knot when we finally had him in a clearing. Not one werewolf would be able to take down such an animal, and even an alpha would need assistance, because they were not built like the lycans. No, werewolves looked like a common dog. The only thing great about them was that they were their size, which is close to a bear, if not bigger. Clearly no match for lycans, and that is why I chose them to begin with. I must create a new breed of werewolves where we reign supreme. Where we can finally reveal ourselves. And ultimately dominate the world. A frown fell on Dexter's lips. A new breed of werewolves. His little mind was puzzled. He couldn't understand why Uncle Victor would try to create such a scary monster like a lycan. Maybe this was Uncle Victor's way of making the world better. Wanting to figure out more, Dexter flipped the pages and spotted an interesting chapter. How to create the perfect werewolf. To counter the lichen being so uncontrollable, I need a strong female werewolf, so my creation will have some sort of moral thinking. At least then I would have some control over my creation. She must be from a pure alpha bloodline, or have similar DNA to our ancestors. Luckily I still had connections to the rogues, who are willing to do my deed of kidnapping daughters of alphas. The first one was from the Red Moon pack. Shy little thing cried too much in my opinion. Quite pathetic for an alpha's daughter, but nevertheless I was only using her body. For my first experiment, I extracted the DNA from the lichen and placed them in the female's eggs. I needed a natural pregnancy, in that way the baby would gain the nutrients and immunity it needs from the mother. The female participants weren't exactly cooperative, and had to be held down to make sure no harm comes to her or the possible baby. A few weeks in, she didn't get pregnant, but instead the DNA of the lichen began to consume her from the inside. I had to dispose of her immediately and begin again. The second candidate was much fiercer than the last and had quite the bloodline. Maybe she could be the one. Dexter read the end and saw that she too didn't make it. Reading through each of the 8 profiles, he noted that all of them died. The last few were the closest to Uncle Victor's goal, as they got pregnant, but the lichen gene was too much for the females. Searching the notes and going through them, Dexter knew what Uncle Victor was missing. It was so simple, but he didn't think of it. All he needed what are you doing here? A loud voice startled little Dexter. He dropped the book and gasped in surprise at his uncle. He knew that Victor wasn't really his uncle, but he took him in when his parents abandoned him for having a stutter. He was extremely scared of the man, especially the way he stared down at him with those black eyes. Dexter made sure he behaved around him and tried to talk as little as possible, because Uncle Victor hated his stutter as well. The intimidating man stood over the little boy. He raised a brow and waited for Dexter to explain. Sorry. Didn't he mean to? Victor raised a hand to shut him up. The boy visibly flinched and kept his head down. Black eyes trailed down to the floor where the boy dropped his precious book. Bending down, Victor picked it and gazed blankly at Dexter. What did you read? Victor asked, knowing the boy could understand what he wrote. Just about the lichens and how you want to see our create AANEW breed. Dexter stammered timidly and fiddled with his fingers. Victor grunted and then pushed the boy away from the desk. He placed the book on the table and sorted out his papers. A few minutes and he noticed Dexter was still standing there. What is it? He said gruffly without looking at Dexter. IIWA was just wondering why you won't combine the L lichens DNA and SSOM1 from the R Royal BL bloodline. Victor's eyes widened suddenly, and he whipped around to face the boy. He grabbed Dexter's shoulders and gave him a little shake. Say that again, he demanded. Wincing at the grip, Dexter explained quickly. The R Royal werewolves H have the closest DNA to lichens B because their ancestors were the first werewolves born. SOSO, they would be more successful to mutate with the gene. Victor's eyes widened in realization. The boy was right. How could he not see it? Victor rushed to the bookshelves and picked out a book he knew all too well. He flicked through it hastily until he found the page. His fingers lightly caressed the picture, and gazed at it with a gentle expression, before it transformed back to his emotionless face. Eleanor Steele, the last royal werewolf. And Victor's mate. She was beautiful. Perfect to be the queen. With a gentle soul and a kind heart, everyone fell in love with her. Victor always wondered why the moon goddess would pair her with someone as dark as him. But then again, he wasn't always evil. His fascination with lichens grew into a deep passion. But once he got a taste, Victor just had to have more. He began researching on lichens in his lab, finding every little thing he could about them. It developed into an obsession until he barely went home to his own mate. Of course Eleanor was worried and stressed for him, but Victor was in far too deep. He tried to get her to see his views, but she wouldn't do it. Eleanor knew she couldn't save her mate, or bring him back to the man he was, and made the hardest decision for the both of them. She let him go. Completely outraged, Victor put every ounce of energy into his research to forget the heartache she caused him. He was trying to make the perfect werewolf to prove to his mate and the council that they are the supreme race. Victor hadn't seen her for 6 years, but it was finally time he pays her a visit, he thought, and violently ripped the paper out the book. Twisting around to the scared boy, "Go tell the rogues to meet me in my office. We have work to do," Victor commanded Dexter, who nodded his head furiously before rushing out the room. A cruel smirk curled on Victor's lips. Maybe that boy was useful after all. Victor really sacrificed his own mate. Slade seethed as he paced in his office. He was too furious to sit down. The thought of his mate's mother was used like a tool for Victor's pleasure was just sickening. Added to that, they were mates. He felt himself begin to shake. His wolf wanted to come out, but he held him in. It was no secret that Eleanor was mates with Victor. Slade turned to his father as he spoke. Both of them used to be a part of the council until Victor went rogue. He tried to take Eleanor with him, but she refused. Paul sighed. They were the first werewolves known to actually separate, after they had been happy together for more than 9 years. Nolan lowly whistled in awe. Ryan was also struck by the news whilst Dexter sat silently, already knowing the story. So what happened after Victor kidnapped her? Slade aimed the question at Dexter. He wanted to get to the bottom of this and know all he can about Victor, because he will come back for 9 and Slade will be ready for him. That's the thing. He didn't need to kidnap her. She came willingly. Dexter said softly. He looked down at his lap and continued, as she knew what Victor was going to do, and she let him. The room was dead silent. All trained on Dexter. I remember as she said it was her last acts of love. He looked at Slade in sadness, as she couldn't live any more without her mate. She let him plant the lichen's DNA in her, and spent her remaining life with Victor. Then she died, giving birth to 9. Dexter shut his eyes as he reminisced. He was 8 at that time, when he watched Victor cut his mate's stomach open to take the baby out. After everything he did to her, still he saw Eleanor give a small, weak smile as she stared at Victor. He knew Victor would not be able to save his mate when he embedded the DNA in Eleanor, and this was the price he had to pay. It was then and there that 8-year-old Dexter knew that what Uncle Victor was doing was wrong. Before, he just thought that Uncle Victor was making the world a better place for werewolves. Even though he was young, Dexter vowed to do all he can to protect the baby from Victor, to make sure she doesn't become anything like him. Number 9 I shall call her after all the failed attempts, Victor said proudly as he lifted up the baby. She didn't cry, but stared back at him almost curiously, like she was studying him a sign for a hunter. He would have preferred a male, but knew they would be much harder to control because of their natural-born instincts to be the dominant one. Victor moved out the room without another glance at his dead mate. His heart was hardened from the moment his mate left him, and not once did he allow himself to open up. Little Dexter turned towards the pretty woman in the pregnancy chair. Her eyes were open, but were not as bright as when she was alive. Out of respect, because she was the first person to ever show him kindness, Dexter reached out with his small hands and closed her eyelids. There. And then now you're sleeping. He smiled grimly and took a moment of silence before going after Victor. Someone else would come and take her body. He could only pray they gave her a proper burial. That sick bastard. The loud bang snapped Dexter out of his reverie. His eyes landed on Alpha Slade. His fists were clenched on the table as he leaned on them. His face was bowed and shook his head in disbelief. Victor will never lay a hand on my mate. All eyes turned to him. He lifted his head, his eyes burned intensely. The others nodded their head, agreeing to protect 9. There's something I must tell you. Dexter spoke up, regaining their attention. It's something I discovered. Slade stepped towards him, his attention solely on Dexter. Whatever the man was going to say was not going to be good. Dexter took a deep breath. N9's a genetic defect. The room was stunned into silence. Dexter continued. Victor thinks she's perfect, but she's not. She is a half-breed. He shook his head and then looked to the alpha. She's dominant like werewolf, that's why Victor can control her. He uses her fear. Slade's jaw clenched. He forced himself to breath. He needed to listen to the rest. The worst was still to come. The BST inside is evolving. Its DNA is slowly taking over her werewolf side. I don't know what will happen to NINE once it takes over. Dexter confessed and watched as everyone in the room took in the news. They were clearly disturbed and stunned. The room was dead silent, when abruptly the door slammed open. Everyone turned towards the man. Alpha, some of the younger pack members are assaulting the rogues in the jailhouse and Jared is letting them saying but he was cut off when Slade immediately raced out the door. The others followed closely behind their alpha. His mind was solely on 9. If anything happened to her, then those teenagers were going to be harshly punished. No one messes with his mate. Slade roared and ran faster towards the jailhouse. Chapter 8. 9 watched silently as the boys laughed. There were 5 of them in total. 4 younger ones about her age, and 1 guard who let them in. He stood at the back of the room, with his arms crossed and a smug smirk on his face. It wasn't their first time taunting rogues. Jared, the guard, would let the teens in and rile up the pathetic wolves. They were not like them, and deserved to be treated like the trash they are. 9's tail swished in irritation behind her, and her eyes in slits were solely on the boys who cracked jokes and tried to provoke a reaction out of her. She was sitting on her hind legs and her claws dug deep into the ground, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. However, the only thing that was stopping her was that she promised Dexter that she would behave, and unless they physically attack her, then she cannot do anything. I bet you would look sexy if you shift into human. The leader of the 4 said with a cocky smirk. So how about it, pretty lady? The others laughed behind him. 9 could feel a growl crawling up her throat. Her lips twitched to hold in a snarl. If they keep this up, then 9 was going to show them how pretty she can be. She could have called for Dexter, but 9 wanted to deal with this herself. She can't always have Dexter with her and must learn to not use violence for everything. But these boys were making it really hard. Maybe she should just kill them and get it over with, she thought darkly. The beast within her agreed and began to pace. I bet I can show you a better time than a worthless rogue. Ha! Nice one, Matt. A friend hollered at the leader. The sentence confused 9, but she didn't let it show. By the tone of his voice, she knew it wasn't anything good. All right, boys, time's up. The guard spoke from the back. Oh, come on, Jared. We want to see her shift, and I bet you want to. Just one peek and then we will go. Matt said and grinned wickedly. Jared smirked in return and then looked at 9 with a glint in his eyes. Maybe we could persuade her. 9's hackles rose. The boys cheered and fist bumped each other when Jared reached for his hip and pulled out a silver-tipped whip. They knew that female rogues were particularly loose when it comes to their body. Frequently unmated males would seek them out to satisfy their needs until they find their mates, but sometimes the stubborn she-wolves just needed a little persuasion. This one was no exception. 9 let out a growl as a warning. The man didn't back down and the boys only encouraged him. So what's it going to be, rogue? Shift or get hit. Jared sneered and cracked the whip loudly in intimidation. 9 was not scared of the man, but the whip brought back emotional scars of her master when he used to remind her who was in charge. Physically, she could take on that whip and feel nothing. All right then, I guess you chose to get hit then. Jared raised his hand with the whip. He paused for a second, noting the she-wolf was not cowering but instead had those demon eyes on him, like she was waiting for something. He growled and tightened his grip on the handle. Better fix it then, he thought. Using his strength, Jared sliced his hand forward. The whip followed and through the gap between the bars, he lashed out, striking 9 right across her face. The impact snapped her head to the side. A deep gash ran from her brow down to the bottom of her jaw. Blood dripped down to the ground as the wound began to heal itself. 9 kept her gaze on the floor. She would not let those mutts get away with hurting her. If she couldn't kill them, then she was going to have to torture them another way. Her eyes slowly began to glow bright red. Showtime, 9, she inwardly snarled. Jared frowned deeply. A stray sweat rolled down his temple as uneasiness settled in. The she-wolf didn't even flinch at his attack, and he used his wolf strength. The other rogues would easily tremble in terror, but not her. Whoa! One of the boys whispered in awe and fear, moving closer to the wall and away from the female. They wouldn't admit it, but they were scared of the rogue. They knew something was wrong with this she-wolf, something unexplainable, unpredictable. Dangerous. Suddenly they detected a shift in the air, making a chill shoot through their spines. It was so strong and powerful that it made their wolves quiver in pure fear. What's going on? Matt called out in panic. The rogue wasn't even looking at them. Her face was still to the side and she sat stock still, but they knew whatever it was coming from her. Let's get out of here. Another boy shouted and then pushed his friend to run out the door. But before he could escape, all at once they felt a heavy force plummet on them like a ton of bricks. Stumbling backwards, a few crashed into the wall while the others tripped and fell to the ground. Frightened, they shuffled away from 9. The boys cried out in pain and gasped for air as the rogue kept up the pressure, pushing against their chest, making them almost suffocate. But in truth, it wasn't even her doing it. It was their own wolves. The sounds of their frantically beating hearts and smell of fear in the air formed an almost wolfish smirk on 9's face. Tilting her head slightly to the side, she locked her eyes on the guard. The beast wanted to particularly teach the mutt a lesson. A burning, hot sensation bled through Jared's chest and extended outwards throughout his body. He felt like his insides were coming out. His eyes bulged and mouth struggled to gasp in air. Clammy hands furiously tried to claw at his body, trying to get rid of the pain. Another excruciating wave shot through him. Ah! He let out a deafening scream and fell to his knees, clutching his head. 9 paid little attention to the teens who watched their friend suffer in horror. They were cowering in the corner, away from her and the guard who blocked their escape. She was about to finish him off when the sound of heavy footsteps and the scent of that green-eyed male interrupted her. Internally she pouted. She never gets to have fun, she thought sourly, her eyes slowly going back to white. She released the guard and watched him collapse to the floor. Jared's body was frozen stiff, but he knew he had to get out of the room and away from that she-wolf. There was no way he was going to experience that torture again. It was like his wolf was tearing out of him in the most painful way possible. Jared tried to calm him down, but there was something terrifying him, making him act out in hysteria. His wolf wanted to escape from something so badly that he wanted to separate from Jared completely. The thought was blood-curdling. Once Jared had movement in his limbs, he didn't hesitate to stand up and race to the door. He forgot about the boys in the back of the room, because he only cared about was his own safety. Jared didn't make it far when a sudden force sent him flying backwards. He cried out as he fell roughly to the floor. He didn't have time to think when he was grabbed by his collar and shoved against the wall. "What did you do to my mate?" Slade roared in the guard's face, eyes turning solid black. He was fuming, the veins on his neck bulged and fists turned white, as he lifted the mud off the ground. He ordered them to not go anywhere near her or let anyone enter the room, but they disobeyed him. He was going to make sure that they all were severely punished. "Well," he snapped and slammed Jared against the wall again. Sorry Alpha Slade. We didn't know she's your mate." Jared whimpered and bowed his head. Slade heard the door open, signaling the rest caught up, but he paid little attention to them. He growled in anger, "Not only that, but you deliberately disobeyed my order and allowed boys into the room, when clearly this place is off limits to pack members." He spat and began to shake. "Maybe I should let your Luna decide your fate." Jared went pale and shook his head vigorously. "Oh goddess, please no. Anything but her." He pleaded desperately. He would be a dead man if his alpha let that she-wolf to punish him. Without his permission, his frightened eyes traveled to the female. 9 caught his eye and snarled mockingly, showing off her jagged teeth. By now Jared looked like a ghost and would faint at any moment. Slade dropped him and reached out to grab the guard's wrist in a tight grip. "Very well. Then your punishment will to bear the mark of shame and dishonor." Please, Alpha." "Not that, please." Jared fell to his knees and begged, tears free-falling as he whimpered. But Slade would not allow such disrespect and insubordinate go unpunished, especially since he was known to treat captured rogues so inhumanely. The final straw was provoking his mate and future Luna. Tightening his hand over the guard's wrist, making the bone begin to snap, Slade began to recite the curse that only an alpha can give. "From this day on, Jared Moss will hereby be stripped of his position as a warrior and bear the mark of shame and dishonor. Every wolf will now recognize you as the weak link of the pack and will be treated as such." A dark gray glow emitted from the guard's wrist. He cried out as his skin began to burn in a specific way. Once Slade removed his hand, the mark began to take its effect on the cursed one. A burnt tattoo of a lone wolf laying on the ground in submission, and surrounding it was other wolves who had their backs to him. Acknowledging that the lone wolf must not be treated as an equal. Slade watched as Jared clutched his wrist and whimpered. The mark was rarely used, but if an alpha sees fit, he will place it on a pack member who is a disgrace or disobedient. There were a few marks an alpha could give to their subordinates, to make sure that all members of a pack would not disobey their leader. The mark also changes the cursed one. They begin to radiate a pungent scent that every wolf will notice and recognize as they are cursed. Jared will experience nothing but the way he treated captured rogues. "Leave," he said. The guard got up and quickly staggered out the room. Slade snapped his head to the left, the deadly glare aimed at the 4 teens who stood silently in submission. "You boys will also be getting your punishment, and don't expect it to be anything less than the guards." He grunted and then nodded towards the exit. The teens moved silently, but quickly out the room with their heads bowed. Slade took the time to calm down. He didn't want his mate to see him like this. She already hated him, no need to add another thing to the list. While his back was to her, 9 used her time to really get a look at the alpha. There was something about him that she just didn't understand. What makes him so different from the other males? Why does she feel calm whenever she's around him? She watched on curiously. 9 used her senses to see any physical difference on him. Maybe he was hiding a bottle of wolfsbane, which could explain why she becomes calm around him. But her nose could not pick up that smell except for his musky and intoxicating scent. 9 sneezed. She sniffed in too much, which made her dizzy for a second. She let out a low growl. That's why she hated that green-eyed man. It was so easy for him to make her feel uneasy and vulnerable when not even her master could do that. She hated being close to him and the way he paid close attention to her. Inside, the beast only wanted to destroy him. Every time the alpha was near he would get agitated. 9 could feel him pace in silent fury, but there was something holding him back, though she didn't know what. Her eyes moved to the door where the rest of the males stood quietly. Dexter was the closest to the cage, and shot her a concerned look. "They didn't do anything serious to me if you are wondering. Just a scratch," she told Dexter and lazily turned back to the alpha. 9 growled in irritation when she noticed she always turns back to look at him. She never paid attention to only one wolf before, but why now? 9 got up to pace the length of the cell. All at once, everything was beginning to sink in. She was out of the arena and away from her master. No more fighting because now she's supposedly a part of a pack. She has to learn to live with other wolves when her instincts are begging her to kill them. But most of all, she had to be around that man. It was too much for her to handle, especially since she spent 19 years in the arena, with barely any experience of the outside world. "What's wrong?" Dexter asked with a worried face, as he watched her pace increase. "I don't like it here. I don't like being near other wolves." 9 spat and eyed everyone in the room before landing on the alpha, who turned around and was carefully looking at her body for any wounds. "I especially hate him." She nodded her big head towards the green-eyed man. Immediately he noticed and locked eyes with her. 9 narrowed her eyes into slits and bared her teeth. Dexter was grateful that Alpha Slade could not hear their conversation, because he would not like what 9 was saying. "I want to go back to the arena," she grumbled, making her friend feel extremely worried. But we will be joining Alpha's SLSL Slade's pack soon." 9 broke eye contact to stare deeply into at Dexter. He gulped at how intensely serious she was being. It was the next words that made Dexter begin to sweat. "Want me to kill him?" she snarled just as a red mist clouded over her eyes. Chapter 9. "Want me to kill him?" 9 snarled, her red eyes glaring at the alpha. No." Dexter shouted and shook his head furiously. "What did she say?" Slade stepped forward, staring straight at 9, but aimed the question at Dexter. He knew they were talking about him, and whatever she said was making Dexter very nervous. He looked everywhere except the alpha. "You can tell him." 9 spoke to her friend and kept her narrowed eyes trained on the alpha. "He can know what I said," she sneered, showing off those sharp teeth. This placed Dexter in a very difficult position. He fiddled with his hands and kept looking between Slade and 9 uneasily. The tension began to build in the room. Thankfully Paul came to the rescue. "Why don't we let them talk?" Paul said, shooting a worried glance at his son. Squeezing his hands firmly before forcefully relaxing them, and Slade sighed in defeat. He shut his eyes tightly and just breathed in his mate's scent, using it to calm himself. He couldn't hide his hurt and longing when he opened his eyes to gaze at 9. God, what he would do to just hold his mate in his arms. Shaking his head, he looked to his father and stiffly nodded his head. He watched as his friends and father left the room. He took a long look at 9 and walked forward. Only when he was at the doorframe did he look away to glance at Dexter. Shooting him a look, Dexter discreetly nodded and Slade left the room. He hoped 9 would tell her friend something to help him become closer to her. Running a hand through his hair, Slade left his faith in Dexter's hand, praying he could talk some sense into his mate. Once they were gone, Dexter finally asked, "Why do you hate Alpha SL Slade?" He knew she didn't trust him, but hopefully she could tell him something more that could help the Alpha get into 9's good books. 9 huffed angrily. She knew the Alpha's name, but refused to recognize it. Acknowledging it was accepting him, and she wouldn't allow that. "So?" Dexter asked again, and sat down on the floor in front of the cage. He needed to somehow convince 9 to at least try and give the others a chance. Hopefully one day she may come to trust them the way she trusts him. Once again 9 began to pace in front of the bars. It's just the way he makes me feel. I don't understand it. There's just something about him that makes me SOSO. She roared in anger. Dexter tried to hide his guilt. He could not tell her that they were mates. It just wasn't the right time. She needed to have some trust for Alpha Slade, because she would mistake the pool as Slade having control over her. She would think he was just like Victor, only using her for his pleasure. He needed to wait until 9 could learn to trust other people to know that they wouldn't hurt her. If he told her now, then it's a guarantee that 9 will hate Slade like the way she loathes Victor. For Alpha Slade, being hated by your mate was pretty much a rejection. N9, can you please give them a chance? Dexter pleaded. Abruptly coming to a stop in front of him, she shot him a hard glare, making her friend flinch at the intensity of her red eyes. I'm trying. But I'm not like you, Dex. She shouted through the link. I cannot simply trust them when all my life I was taught to kill them. Her friend looked down in shame, making 9 feel bad for letting out her anger on him. I'm so I guess I just want you to finally be free and experience the world. Dexter mumbled and drew random patterns on the concrete floor. 9 sat down in front of him, her expression softening a little. I'm sorry, Dex, but it's hard for me. I'm not like them. They don't have a monster inside of them that always wants to kill everything in sight. She replied and laid her head down on her front paws. Dexter reached out to caress 9's dark fur through the gap, making her purr. But you'll let me, he said softly. 9 raised her head to look him in his eyes. That's because you are my family and best friend. You are important to me. But the others could also become your family. Maybe even accept Alpha SL Slade AA. 9 was quick to cut Dexter off and abruptly stood up and turned away from him. No. She boomed loudly, making Dexter recoil. Not him. She growled. I can't stay here, Dex. She looked at him with a stricken look in her eyes. You know that fighting helps me control the beast. If I can't fight, then how will I restrain him? What happens if he bursts out and I can't stop him? What happens if I kill you? She whispered the last part and looked at him pleadingly. 9 shook her head furiously and blinked away the water in her eyes. I could not live with myself if I hurt you. Dexter's face fell at the sight of her. He opened his mouth to speak, but 9 continued. Besides, they wouldn't want someone like me. Her voice hardening, they wouldn't want to become friends with someone who could easily turn on them in a blink of an eye. She looked sharply at Dexter, the beast revealing a little of itself through her clouded eyes. Then why didn't you? Dexter said loudly, his brows furrowing in anger. What? 9 asked, not knowing where her friend's sudden anger coming from. Dexter stood up and took a step forward. He straightened his back to stand tall, catching 9 in surprise. Why didn't you kill me when we first met? Why you hated me then? Because you thought I was like Victor. You could easily killed me all those years ago, but you didn't. Why? 9 gazed at him before turning away to stare blankly at the wall. She didn't have an answer for him. There was nothing she could say to prove him wrong. When she was younger, 9 was far worse than she was now. She had no control over the beast and had to learn how to contain him over the years. She remembered the day she almost killed Dexter. 6-year-old 9 constantly had a crazed look in her cat eyes. The beast was mostly in control of her little form from the moment of her first shift at the age of 5. Already at this tender age she took down 4 fully grown men, and was easily capable to slaughter a gentle, 14-year-old boy. She was pacing in her small cage. No one entered the room except for Dexter, who she found as an annoying nuisance that 9 would love to get rid of, but she never got the chance until today. 9 was distressed, which caused the beast to become more agitated and quickly lash out at anyone close by. The silver collar her master put on was on too tight. Every time she moved, it dug into her skin. She had to be careful with the way she moved her head, or else she could end up choking herself. No one dared to go inside her cage to help her except one. Dexter noticed her struggle, and didn't hesitate to enter her domain. Immediately 9 pounced on him, and held him down on his back. She growled loudly in his face. The beast wanted to maul him, and was about to when she suddenly paused her deadly intentions. Maybe it was the look in his kind eyes, or how even now, when he knows he was about to die, he kept staring at her, not a single sign of being afraid. For the first time, 9 did not give in to the beast's command. She used everything inside that little body of hers to pull away. The large grin Dexter gave her that day was something she would never forget. It was one of her fondest memories. Even to this day, whenever Dexter would smile at her proudly, it would bring her back to that memory when he became her everything. I trust you with my life, 9. Dexter's voice broke her out of her trance. I know you seek and control HMB, but you are us using HM as an excuse when really you are just scared. 9 laid down, her back facing Dexter. She didn't want him to see how right he was. She was terrified. What if they were like her master? One of them already hit her with a whip. Who's to know that they will treat her any different than when she was in the arena? 9 closed her eyes and curled her body in a vulnerable position. Dexter sighed and looked at her in sadness. At least give Alpha Slade a chance. If he hurts you, then we will run away. Okay, 9. He pleaded, but was met with silence. Sighing again, Dexter moved towards the door. The sun was setting. Hopefully one day he could show 9 the sunset, but for now, he would give her time to think. Good night. He whispered and closed the door, leaving her in a cold cell with the only light coming from the small window above 9's head. Taking a deep breath and letting it out in defeat, 9 pulled her body inward even more. She just wanted to leave. She didn't want to trust anyone else. Her master taught her that many of the werewolves were as cruel as him. Dexter was too trusting, which confused her greatly because he didn't have a reason to even get close to another person. His parents abandoned him, master was not nice to him, and even 9 tried to kill him, and yet, he so carelessly trusts those werewolves. 9 wished she could return to the arena. She never told Dexter that she hoped that a much stronger werewolf would come along and defeat her, taking her away from this world. She knew she doesn't belong among those wolves, or anywhere for that matter. She was nothing but a weapon for her master. Nothing more, nothing less. 9 placed her paw over her muzzle and quietly whimpered. Tomorrow she will return into the cold, silent monster her master trained her to be, but for now, she will allow herself to crave for something she will never have. 9's ears perked at the sound of the door opening. Her back was still facing the entrance, but she could smell him. Holding in a growl, she opted to ignore his presence. She decided to test him and see how long it takes him to snap at her. Her master wouldn't allow her to ignore him, and would easily deliver painful blows to her body as punishment. Maybe the green-eyed male will be the same. She heard him clear his throat, but 9 kept her eyes closed. I brought you some breakfast. Her ear twitched slightly at the sound of his deep voice. She almost grumbled to herself for letting him have even a small effect on her. 9's nose suddenly got a whiff of something else. Something far more delicious than that male's scent. It had to be coming from the food he brought. It was strange to her because her normal diet was raw meat, and that's all she's ever given. Her master made sure of it, saying something about a wild wolf should not be treated like a spoilt human's pet. She never did understand him, but 9 wasn't one to complain. Her master gave her what she needed to survive. Breathing heavily out, she continued to lay down and ignore the green-eyed male in the room. Upon hearing his sigh in frustration, She felt her lips twitch. It didn't take him long to get angry, 9 thought almost smugly and waiting for him to lash out. Seconds passed and the male shuffled. 9 strained her ears to figure out what he was doing, but when she heard silence, she took a risk and stretched out from her cold position. She made sure to lay straight and not face the male directly, but she could peek at him through the corner of her eye. Her eyes narrowed into slits when she spotted him coolly sitting against the wall. One leg was propped up whilst the other was straight, and he casually laid his hand on his knee. Unconsciously her fur bristled at the way his eyes stared intensely at her. It was not like her master's wicked gaze, but something like the way Dexter looked at her. The male stared with a soft expression. His mouth lifted into a small smile once he noticed her watching. He pushed the tray closer to the cage. It was filled with food that she could recognize when Dexter showed her on his laptop, but have never tasted before. Speaking of her friend, where was he? Hungry. 9 responded with a low growl, and for some reason it made the green-eyed male chuckle. She sneered and took a quick look to the door in hopes of Dexter coming, but then turned away, and resumed her curled-up position. Slade caught her eye movement and understood what she wanted. Though he was irritated that his mate always looked to another male instead of him, but Slade knew that Dexter and 9 will never have a romantic relationship. However, it didn't stop the jealousy from bubbling within him. If you're wondering about Dexter, he's fine. Just trying to settle in the pack house and getting to know the others. Slade ran a hand through his hair and watched her for a reaction before continuing. He didn't come this morning because I asked him if I could bring you breakfast instead. He shrugged even though 9 wasn't watching him. He hoped that by being nice to Dexter that she might come to trust him a little more. You should really eat before it gets cold, he said. 9 once again ignored him. Her eyes were wide open as she stared blankly at the wall in front of her. She couldn't let her guard down around the male. Dexter told me to keep you in the cage, even though I hate it so much. The male grumbled in anger and then took a deep breath. I thought that maybe we can get to know one another. Silence was his reply. But that would not deter Slade. He would keep trying until he finally gets through to his stubborn mate. Clearing his throat, Slade thought that maybe telling 9 about himself might show her that he wasn't like Victor. Since you're not much of a talker, he and unknowingly also his mate almost snorted at his comment, I thought I'd tell you things about myself. Pausing, Slade watched for a response. When nothing happened, he began to sprout random things about himself. He began with his favorite things, and then started to tell his mate about his wild childhood. Slade was half in his own world as he explained the crazy things he, Ryan and Nolan did as kids. He failed to notice that 9 was quietly listening, as her ears twitched whenever he laughed at a memory, or when his voice would speak softly, as he talked about his family and especially his sisters Tori and Ariana. She may hate the male, but 9 was curious about a wolf being out of the arena. She never got to talk to any of the werewolves that weren't rogues, except Dexter of course, but he didn't count completely because he too didn't know what it's like to personally live in a pack. It was both their first times being in one. 9 listened closely as he told her of the story he and his friends got in trouble, and the older alpha that smelt like the green-eyed male caught them. She thought he would then describe the harsh punishment they received, but 9 became puzzled when he told her that their punishment was to clean the whole pack house. 9 was about to ask him why the alpha didn't physically hurt them, but she was quick to restrain herself. She wouldn't talk to the male. She wanted him to leave and talking would make him stay. Thankfully 9 was distracted by a shout coming from outside the jail cell. Standing up, she moved towards the window. The male had stopped talking and was now watching her curiously. What is it? He asked, but she ignored him and lifted her head to gaze out the small window. She didn't even have to stretch that much as the window was just a little higher than her head. Her cat eyes spied a group of boys pushing each other around and laughing. She watched with deep interest as one tackled another to the ground. 9 thought that he would go for the kill, but instead he just laughed at the one he attacked. Tilting her head in confusion, 9 was surprised that none of them were trying to slay each other, but they were fighting. 9. She turned to face the male who was frowning. 9 didn't have Dexter her to explain why the boys were not taking the fight seriously when easily one could turn on them. She needed to know why those wolves aren't killing each other. It was just not right. It was rule number 2 her master taught her. If you fight to the death. Rule number 1 being always trust master, never any other werewolf. 9 remembered the day he told her about the rules. She was only 5 then. Growing up, he drilled many rules, but made sure that particular rule was always first. He may be her master and his creation, but 9 would not trust him with her life. She was not stupid. She could never trust a man who abused her, but that did not stop her fear of him growing. She would always fear her master. 9. What is it? The male's voice pulled her back to reality. He was standing now with a concerned face. Not bothering to continue on the plan of ignoring him, 9 twisted around until she was standing in front of him and asked the question that was bothering her. Those boys. She nodded towards the window before staring into those green eyes. I don't understand why they didn't try to kill each other. 2 of them were fighting, but the stronger one didn't finish off the weaker one. Why? The male immediately turned dark, which made 9 bristle, and watch him cautiously. She saw him shut his eyes and took a deep breath before reopening them. They were training to become stronger. Slade spoke slowly, trying to hold in his anger for what Victor did to his mate. Making her think that every fight only needed one winner. How does that make you stronger? It's not like they will experience the real feeling of getting bitten, or learning to mask the pain and continue on fighting. 9 replied seriously. With her experience in the arena, she found it much easier as time passed. Her mind and body were always prepared whenever a wolf attacked her. Nothing phases her anymore, well, except whenever her master gets angry. We do not work alone. If a member is injured, then another pack member will protect him. A pack works as one. Slade said through gritted teeth. Just how deep was his mate's hate for packs? Did Dexter know about this? Huffing at his stupid reply, 9 moved away and laid on the ground. Her plan to ignoring was resumed, as she pretended the male didn't exist. She heard the male sigh in irritation. How about you tell me something about yourself? He asked instead. 9 flicked her tail but said nothing. The green-eyed male was annoyingly persistent, much to her displeasure. You know I'm just going to keep asking you stuff until you answer one of them. He said in a challenging tone. Her silence gave him go signal. Okay then. And then Slade sprouted out the most random of questions, half of which 9 didn't know. Minutes ticked by and his voice was getting to her. Every now and then, her lips, ears and tail twitched in irritation and the male noticed it, which only encouraged him even more. If there was one person you could be with, who would it be? Not you. Just please keep quiet. I know I'd pick you. He let out a low chuckle. Okay, how about this? If you could go somewhere, where would you go? A low growl began to rumble in her chest, but the male was too busy talking to notice. Once again, I'd go wherever you go. She could practically feel the grin from here. The next question though set her off the edge. Okay, last question, will you give me a chance? In a second, 9 was on her feet and standing inches from the bars, snarling viciously at the male. Slade didn't even flinch at her sudden aggressiveness, because he knew it was coming. Why should I even give you a chance? She snapped viciously. Eyes narrowed and teeth bared. Calmly, Slade stood up from his spot and walked slowly to his mate, not once breaking eye contact. Because you are the most important person to me. The soft and gentle tone in his voice caught Nine off guard. No one else had ever spoke to her like that except Dexter. Her snarling lowered until she was heavily breathing, but kept her deadly glare on him. Slade's eyes softened, yet it still showed his determination. No matter what, Nine, I will keep coming back every day, because I will show you that I am not like Victor. Slowly Slade lifted his hand and reached out to his mate. I would never hurt you the way he did. His hand slipped through the bars, but Nine was too stiff to move. She couldn't turn away from the tender look in the male's eyes. I won't give up on you, Nine. His hand was inches from her face. Just give me a chance to show you. He whispered just as his hand brushed lightly against her fur. Be part of our werewolf community. Subscribe.